A severed head can remain conscious for up to 30 seconds, a grotesque half-minute where lips still move, eyes still blink, and the brain knows exactly what has happened. In May 1536, on a low scaffold inside the Tower of London, England's most famous queen faced that possibility. Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII, knelt not just to die, but to be dismantled. The story we inherit says she was guilty of treason and met a quick, merciful death by a skilled French swordsman. The truth is darker. Anne's execution was not a simple sentence. It was a performance calculated, theatrical, and designed to erase her memory. Before the blade ever touched her skin, she had been stripped of her dignity, her legacy, and even her daughter's future. So how does a woman crowned in Westminster Abbey end up buried in an arrow chest? Her portraits destroyed, her name forbidden at court. How does a queen become an afterthought within 3 years of her coronation? The answer lies in power and the lengths a king would go to secure it. Anne's death was not just an end. It was a political experiment in psychological torture and historical erasure. And the curse wasn't mystical at all. It was man-made, deliberate, and entirely avoidable. If you want to know how history's most shocking downfalls were engineered, stay with us and subscribe to join the investigation. Welcome to Cursed Chambers, where we learn that the deadliest curses are written not in magic, but in human hands. In May of 1536, the Queen of England was arrested. No armies clashing, no dramatic chase through castle halls. Just a small group of royal officers walking in, telling Anne Boleyn she was under arrest and leading her out. Her destination? The Tower of London. And here's the thing about the Tower: when a queen walks in as a prisoner, she doesn't walk out again. Everyone knew it, including Anne. It's almost cruel when you realize she had stayed in those same apartments just 3 years earlier, but back then it was for her coronation. Crowds cheered, bells rang, and she was about to be crowned Henry VIII's queen. Now same walls, completely different story. Instead of trumpets, there was silence and the sound of keys turning in locks. The charges against her were wild: adultery with multiple men, a plot to murder the king, and the big headline grabber, incest with her brother George. Yes, you heard that right. They accused her of sleeping with her own brother. On paper, it looked devastating, but once you peek at the details, it falls apart fast. Testimonies contradicted each other. Dates didn't match. One of the men wasn't even in England when the affair supposedly happened. Small problem, right? Didn't matter. The case wasn't about truth. It was about getting Anne out of the way. And when powerful men want someone gone, facts become optional. So there she was, locked up for 17 long days. Alone. No friends, no family, no allies. Just guards who didn't say much and walls that seemed to get smaller by the hour. Every morning she must have wondered, is today the day? Every night she went to sleep not knowing if she'd wake up to freedom or an executioner. The stress showed. Sometimes she prayed, sometimes she cried, and sometimes she laughed. Loud, strange laughter that startled the guards. Was it nerves? Was it defiance? Was it Anne thinking, if I'm going down, I might as well make them uncomfortable? We'll never know. But that image stuck. Meanwhile, outside the tower, the rumor mill was in overdrive. Taverns were buzzing. Merchants gossiped in markets. People wanted to believe the scandal because it was juicy, and Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, made sure those stories spread far and wide. By the time the trial rolled around, the crowd didn't need convincing. They had already made up their minds guilty, and at court, allies evaporated overnight. Nobles who once praised Anne wouldn't even speak her name. To support her was to risk the king's anger, and nobody was volunteering for that. All the qualities that once made her powerful, her intelligence, her ambition, her sharp wit, were suddenly twisted into evidence of arrogance and guilt. But here's the part that probably haunted her the most: her daughter, Elizabeth. She was only 3 years old, too young to understand any of this. But Anne knew exactly what was at stake. If she was branded guilty, Elizabeth wouldn't just lose her mother. She'd lose her legitimacy, her claim to the throne. That fear must have been worse than the execution itself. 17 days. That's how long Anne lived in limbo. 17 days of waiting for the axe or the sword, or maybe a miracle that would never come. So when her trial finally began, the outcome wasn't a mystery. Everyone knew it. The court was packed with people who had already decided her fate. Anne stood proud. She defended herself with courage and clarity. But it didn't matter. The verdict was sealed before she even walked in. She was no longer a queen in their eyes. She was simply a condemned woman waiting for her last chapter. And that last chapter, the trial as pure theater, the execution of her brother, the calculated humiliation that followed. That's where the story really takes its darkest turn. We'll dive into that in the next part. Anne Boleyn's trial was never meant to discover the truth. It was meant to display her destruction. The courtroom was crowded with nobles who owed their loyalty to the kingmen who already knew which side of history they wanted to be on. Anne defended herself with sharp words and steady composure, but it was like shouting into the wind. The verdict had been written before she entered. Guilty of adultery, guilty of incest, guilty of treason, guilty of every sin that could strip her crown and crush her legacy. The sentence was clear death, but the spectacle didn't stop there. Before Anne's final moment could arrive, others had to fall first. 5 men were condemned alongside her courtiers' friends, and most devastatingly, her brother George. Their executions were public theater. The crowds gathered at Tower Hill eager for blood and gossip, and they were not disappointed. One by one, the men were marched out, forced to kneel, and struck down by the axe. The sound of heads hitting straw was meant to echo back into Anne's prison chamber. Each blow reminded her that her allies were gone and her family name was being butchered in real time. George Boleyn's death carried an extra cruelty. His speech on the scaffold was bold, refusing to admit guilt, refusing to grant the king the satisfaction of his shame. But boldness didn't save him. When his head fell, Anne lost more than a brother. She lost the last thread of dignity tying her family to the crown. Henry had made his point. No one connected to Anne would leave untouched. And still Henry delayed her execution. Days passed. Rumors spread that it would happen tomorrow or the next day, or the day after that. Each postponement dragged Anne through a fresh wave of terror. Imagine lying in your cell, preparing yourself for death, then being told, "Not today." Relief would flicker for a moment only to curdle into dread when the sun rose again. It was psychological torture at its most refined. She was being unstitched one day at a time. Eyewitnesses reported strange behavior in those final days. She sometimes laughed at nothing startling her attendants. She sometimes whispered prayers over and over until her voice gave out. The court whispered that the queen had lost her mind. But perhaps it wasn't madness. Perhaps it was survival, the only way left to control how she was remembered. If she laughed, she wasn't broken. If she prayed, she was faithful. If she endured, she denied Henry the satisfaction of seeing her collapse. Meanwhile, the city waited. London thrived on spectacle, and the downfall of a queen was the greatest show of all. Gossip painted Anne as a seductress, a sorceress, a woman who had bewitched the king and now paid the price. Never mind that the evidence didn't hold. The narrative was irresistible. Cromwell had done his job well. By May 19, 1536, the stage was set. The crowd gathered restless and eager because this was more than an execution. It was the end of a reign, the erasure of a queen, the rewriting of history in real time, and Anne knew it. She walked to the scaffold with eyes wide open, dressed with care, holding herself with a dignity that defied the ropes, the swords, and the jeers around her. What she said in those final minutes would be remembered for centuries. But the question remains, were her words submission or subtle rebellion? That will unravel next. May 19, 1536. The morning was clear, the sky deceptively calm, as Anne Boleyn was led from her chambers to the scaffold. The tower's grounds were crowded with spectators, some curious, some hostile, all eager to witness the fall of a queen. It was not a private affair. It was theater staged for the city and designed for history. Even the details of the scaffold told a story. Unlike the high wooden platforms used for nobles on Tower Hill, Anne's was built low, only a few steps off the ground. This forced her into closer proximity with the crowd, a humiliating intimacy that made her final moments a spectacle rather than a solemn ritual. Every face was near enough to see her expression, to read the tension in her hands, to judge whether she trembled. Anne wore a dark gown, her hood drawn tight, her posture upright. Every movement was deliberate, as if she understood that her death would be the last act she controlled. She looked neither broken nor defiant, but steady, composed, even regal. It was a statement without words: you may strip me of everything else, but you will not strip me of how I face the end. Then came the speech. Tradition demanded it. The condemned were expected to address the crowd, to confess sins, to affirm loyalty, to create closure for the spectators. Anne did not protest her innocence. She did not condemn the king. Instead, she thanked God, declared her submission, and praised Henry as a kind and merciful ruler. On the surface, it sounded like obedience, almost like gratitude, but historians have long debated her tone. Was it sincere, or was it a carefully crafted performance, words chosen to shield her daughter Elizabeth from further disgrace? Some believe it was Anne's last weapon, a speech so flawlessly controlled that it disguised condemnation as praise. By calling Henry merciful, she underlined the cruelty of what everyone could see: a woman executed on charges no one truly believed. The crowd listened in silence. There were no jeers, no shouts, only the strange hush of people realizing they were watching something unprecedented. A Queen of England kneeling not on a throne, but before a swordsman. Anne removed her headdress, revealing her long neck. She knelt upright, refusing the blindfold, insisting on facing her death with open eyes. The French executioner stepped forward, his sword hidden behind his back. It was meant as a kindness. The shock of seeing the blade could cause panic, but in reality, it was another layer of theater. Anne turned her head slightly, murmuring a final prayer, and then, with a signal to his assistant to create a distraction, the swordsman struck. One clean blow. The head fell quick and silent into straw. The crowd gasped. For a moment, all that remained was the thud of the body collapsing beside it. Yet witnesses swore they saw Anne's lips move after the strike, a faint murmur of prayer or breath, proof that for a few terrible seconds, her mind might have remained aware. If true, then Anne Boleyn experienced the very nightmare whispered in folklore consciousness, lingering after death, trapped in a body already severed from life. Her remains were placed hastily into an old arrow chest, too small for a queen's dignity, and buried without ceremony in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula. No grand tomb, no monumental inscription, just a hurried disposal as if she were an inconvenient problem to be cleared away. Her name was ordered erased from the court. Her portraits destroyed or hidden, her daughter declared illegitimate. In Henry's design, Anne was to vanish, reduced to nothing more than a warning to others. But history is stubborn. The execution meant to erase her, instead immortalized her. The woman who walked to the scaffold with dignity became a legend, and her daughter Elizabeth would one day reclaim the crown Henry tried to deny her. Anne Boleyn's final act was not silence. It was memory. A performance so controlled that it survived the centuries, a reminder that power can destroy a body, but not always the story that follows. And that story, the political machinery behind Anne's destruction, the boiling pressures that made it inevitable, is what we'll uncover in the next part. In June 1533, London transformed into a stage. Banners stretched across the streets, fountains poured wine, and crowds pressed shoulder to shoulder just to watch the new queen pass by. Anne Boleyn, triumphant and unshaken, was crowned at Westminster Abbey, the very symbol of England's break with Rome. She was radiant, a woman who had forced a king to tear down centuries of tradition for her sake. To many, she seemed untouchable. Her power in those first months was undeniable. Courtiers bowed lower, ambassadors sought her favor, and poets compared her to the dawn itself. Anne was no quiet ornament. She was sharp, witty, confident, unafraid to spar with Henry or anyone else at court. She was the rare queen who appeared more partner than consort, and she wielded that role with pride. Then came the child. In September, Anne gave birth to Elizabeth, healthy and strong, but not the long-promised son. Anne adored her daughter, certain more children would follow, but around her, the mood shifted. Whispers threaded through the corridors. A girl, only a girl. The pageantry of her coronation dimmed almost overnight. Henry masked his disappointment in public, yet his courtiers could read it in his eyes. For the first time, the brilliance of Anne's triumph flickered. She still believed the crown was secure. Daughters could come first, sons could follow. She carried herself with the same fire, projecting confidence and certainty. But beneath the applause, the tone of the court had changed. The air was cooler, the smiles thinner, the loyalty more cautious. What looked like stability was already the beginning of a slide. By the following year, the tension was visible. Anne suffered miscarriages, each one eroding the confidence that had once surrounded her. To Henry's enemies, they were not tragedies, but opportunities. A queen who could not produce a male heir was a queen whose reign could be questioned. Thomas Cromwell, who had once worked alongside her to sever England from Rome, began to see her as a liability. She argued too fiercely, demanded too much, clashed with nobles who wanted to be handled gently. What once had been her strength was now a danger. And where there is danger, there are rivals waiting. Jane Seymour appeared then, pale, quiet, obedient, the perfect contrast to Anne's fire. Henry noticed her, and when Henry noticed, everyone else followed. The Seymour family quickly rose, aligning themselves with the king's shifting mood. Anne saw it happening. She scolded Henry, confronted him, tried to fight for his attention with the sharpness that had once thrilled him. But now, instead of fueling his desire, it grated. He wanted peace. He wanted a son. He was no longer certain Anne could give him either. Foreign diplomats whispered home that the king's affection was cooling. Old allies withdrew, cautious not to tie themselves too closely to a queen whose position looked less secure with each passing month. In public, Anne smiled, paraded Elizabeth in velvet gown, spoke with fire in her voice, as though nothing had changed. But everything had. What had begun as celebration was turning into calculation. The court no longer viewed her as the radiant queen of a new age, but as a woman on the edge of failure. Her crown was still on her head, yet the foundation beneath it was cracking. Slowly, silently, the ground was shifting beneath her feet, and she did not realize how close she was to losing everything. By 1535, Anne Boleyn's crown still glittered, but its weight had become unbearable. The court that once bowed eagerly before her now watched her with suspicion, searching for signs of weakness. Henry's gaze had shifted. His eyes lingered on Jane Seymour, who played the part Anne never could, gentle, submissive, silent. Where Anne met Henry's temper with fire, Jane lowered her eyes and folded her hands. The contrast was not lost on him, nor on anyone else. Anne felt the change and fought back. She confronted Henry in private, scolded him in public, tried to command the same passion that had once made him risk everything for her. But each quarrel drove him further away. He wanted obedience, not resistance. He wanted a son, not excuses. Each miscarriage became more than a personal grief. It became evidence against her. Courtiers whispered that she was cursed, that she was arrogant, that God himself had turned his face. Those who had once been allies now crossed the room to stand with the Seymours. Cromwell, the great engineer of Henry's break with Rome, now engineered her downfall with equal efficiency. He collected gossip like coins, polished it into accusations, and waited for the king's nod. Ambassadors reported that Anne had lost the king's heart. Her enemies knew she would not last, and her friends no longer dared to defend her. She was still queen, still formidable, but she was increasingly alone. The palace itself became a prison. Anne's words, once witty and admired, now echoed back as arrogance. Her sharp tongue, once a weapon, became her noose. Even small gestures were twisted into proof of instability. Each council meeting added another layer of isolation. Every day brought fresh evidence that the tide had turned. And still she pressed on, smiling for the crowds parading Elizabeth, as though love and pride could shield them both. By the spring of 1536, the pattern was clear to everyone but Anne. The king had decided. Jane Seymour waited quietly in the background, and Henry needed her to step forward. The miscarriage of a son that January gave him the excuse he wanted. Cromwell moved quickly, arranging charges that were lurid, impossible, and perfectly effective. Treason, adultery, incest, conspiracy to kill the king. The list was long, the witnesses pliable, the outcome certain. Anne did not yet know it, but her fate had already been written. Once she had been the most powerful woman in England, crowned with the promise of a dynasty. Now she was surrounded by whispers and daggers, with no path of escape. The court she had once commanded had closed in around her, every door locked, every ally vanished. She still wore her crown, but only because no one had yet reached to take it from her. And then the moment came. She was arrested in May and taken to the Tower of London, the very place where she had once watched another queen fall. The irony was brutal, almost theatrical. To the outside world, it seemed sudden, a dramatic collapse. But for those inside the court, it was the final act of a process that had been building for years. A slow, steady tightening of the rope until she could no longer move. What destroyed Anne Boleyn was not one mistake or one rival, but the gradual erosion of her place day by day, month by month, until she stood surrounded with no allies and no defenses. The crown that had been her triumph became the very thing that marked her for ruin, and once the king had resolved to be rid of her, there was no force in England that could save her. The charges against Anne Boleyn looked devastating on the surface. They accused her of betraying her husband, her crown, and her country. According to the indictment, she had taken 5 lovers within the walls of the palace, including her own brother George Boleyn. She was said to have conspired with them to kill the king, a crime that touched the very heart of treason. The document was thick with dates, names, and dramatic detail. It was a perfect story for those who wanted to believe the queen was not just unfit, but monstrous. To the public, hearing whispers of adultery and incest confirmed what envy and rumor had already suggested. Anne was dangerous. She had bewitched the king to secure her crown, and now she was willing to risk the stability of the realm to keep it. In the courtroom, the performance was complete. The jurors were men handpicked to convict, their loyalty tied directly to Henry or Cromwell. Anne sat as the spectacle unfolded, forced to listen to accusations that painted her as a woman of uncontrolled lust, manipulating noblemen and plotting regicide. There was no defense strong enough to pierce that wall of certainty. Every gasp from the audience reinforced the inevitability of her fate. And yet, even as the words rang out, something about the story didn't quite fit. The charges were almost too perfect, too lurid, too well-timed. The list of names read less like the results of an honest investigation and more like the script of a play, one written with a single ending in mind. On paper, Anne Boleyn was guilty beyond redemption, but paper is patient and paper lies. When you look closely, the case begins to unravel. The dates alone are riddled with impossibilities. One accusation placed Anne in bed with a courtier at a time when she was recovering from childbirth, barely able to stand. Another claimed she committed adultery, while Henry himself was present in the same palace in a chamber crowded with servants. Still another had her in 2 different towns at once, a feat that even the fastest horse could not have managed. These contradictions should have collapsed the case. Instead, they were ignored. The court wasn't looking for truth, it was looking for closure. The witnesses were no better. Mark Smeaton, the court musician, confessed under conditions that made the truth irrelevant. His admission was paraded as proof, even though it had been wrung from him by intimidation and the threat of torture. Others were accused not because of evidence, but because they were convenient. George Boleyn, Anne's brother, was too close to her, too visible, too easy a target. To charge him was to stain Anne permanently. The more grotesque the story, the harder it became for her to escape it. What better way to annihilate a queen's reputation than to brand her as both adulterous and incestuous traitor? Once you peel back the layers, the prosecution's brilliance lies not in its proof, but in its spectacle. The accusations were never meant to be tested. They were meant to shock. They created an image of Anne so corrupt that no one dared to defend her. Every impossible date, every contradictory witness, every hole in the story was smoothed over by the sheer weight of repetition. Say it enough times, and it becomes truth. And so the trial marched forward, not on evidence, but on narrative. The verdict was not the discovery of guilt, but the confirmation of what those in power had already decided. The records remain a tangle of lies and exaggerations, and yet they achieved exactly what they were designed to do: They left Anne defenseless in a courtroom that had been transformed into a stage, and the outcome had been written before she even stepped inside. Behind the charges stood men who understood power better than truth. Thomas Cromwell, once Anne's ally, had turned executioner. He was a master of survival, a man who could smell when the wind was shifting. He had helped Anne rise, had engineered the king's divorce from Catherine, had broken England's bond with Rome. But by 1536, she had become an obstacle. Her sharp tongue, her rivalry with powerful families, her insistence on policies that cut against Cromwell's financial interests, all of it made her dangerous. And Cromwell had no intention of being dragged down with her. He gathered informants, scripted testimonies, and fed Henry exactly the story the king wanted to hear. The Seymours, with Jane waiting quietly in the wings, stood ready to replace Anne and restore peace to Henry's household. Every faction had something to gain from her downfall. Henry's role was quieter but no less decisive. He did not draft the charges, did not sign the witness statements, did not need to. His silence was enough. Everyone knew that if the king desired Anne's survival, she would be untouchable. That protection was gone. His approval of Cromwell's plan was unspoken, but absolute. Henry's ego required justification. He could not admit that his marriage had been a mistake or that his obsession had burned itself out. The charges allowed him to reframe history. Anne was not his failed queen. She was a traitor. By destroying her, he preserved his own image. And so the trial was never about what Anne did. It was about what Henry needed her to be. The brilliance of the operation was that it did not stop with a guilty verdict. Killing Anne was not enough. To secure the king's legacy, she had to be erased. And so the psychological warfare began. Her execution date was set, then postponed, then changed again, keeping her in a cycle of hope and despair. Each dawn could have been her last. Each delay chipped away at her strength. The rumors spread through London like wildfire that she laughed manically in the Tower, that she practiced witchcraft, that she carried deformities on her body. Every lie became part of the script, painting her as unworthy not only to live, but to be remembered. When Anne walked to the scaffold, the stage had already been prepared. The platform was deliberately low, forcing her to meet the eyes of the crowd. The audience was primed to see not a queen, but a cautionary tale, a woman undone by arrogance and sin. Her final speech, carefully composed praising the king's mercy, was framed as submission, not dignity. Even the method of execution was chosen for its symbolism of French swordsmen, quick and precise, so that Henry could claim he had spared her suffering. But mercy was never the point. The real cruelty lay in the performance that surrounded the blade. This was the true sentence, not just death, but the rewriting of memory. The court chroniclers recorded the official story, and the public carried it forward. Anne's enemies inherited the stage. Her daughter Elizabeth was set aside her mother's name, too dangerous to speak aloud. The legacy of witch whore and traitor stuck not because it was true, but because it was useful. For Henry, for Cromwell, for the Seymours' erasure was victory. And in the silence that followed, it almost worked. Almost. Anne Boleyn's body was carried from the scaffold in a common arrow chest, the kind used for storing bolts of a crossbow, because no coffin had been prepared for a queen. She was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula inside the Tower, her grave unmarked. A woman who had been crowned in Westminster Abbey only 3 years earlier now rested in anonymity. For Henry and his court, that was the point. The less she was remembered, the safer their own legacies became. But memory is not so easily erased. The attempt to annihilate Anne's reputation left cracks that historians still peer through. Her daughter Elizabeth, born of the marriage that had cost England its bond with Rome, would one day return to the throne as one of its most formidable monarchs. Every slight against Anne became sharper when viewed in the light of her child's future. The disappointment of a girl had become the ruler who defined an era. It was the ultimate irony. The daughter of the disgraced queen became the living rebuke to those who had tried to erase her. The echoes of Anne's execution also reverberated through politics and religion. Henry remarried quickly, choosing Jane Seymour, who would finally give him the son he craved. Cromwell's triumph was short-lived. Within a few years, he too would be executed on trumped-up charges. The machine of erasure that had destroyed Anne eventually consumed its own architect. Power in Tudor England was not stable. It shifted like sand, burying allies and enemies alike. Anne was not the last to fall, only the most memorable. For those who witnessed it, the lesson was unmistakable. The court was not a place of loyalty, but of survival. If a crowned queen could be turned into a criminal in less than 3 weeks, anyone could. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion grew thicker, and the Tudor dynasty tightened its grip on image and control. Anne's destruction became a template, a way to rid the throne of inconvenient wives or rivals. The strategy was too effective to remain unique, and yet centuries later, Anne Boleyn refuses to disappear. Her story continues to provoke fascination, sympathy, and outrage. We do not speak of her as Henry's failed wife, but as a woman caught in the gears of power. The records that condemned her are now read as evidence not of her guilt, but of the machinery that needed her gone. The very lies designed to erase her have preserved the outlines of the truth. She has become more than a queen or a victim. She is a symbol of how fragile reputation is and how ruthlessly it can be manipulated. That is the true curse. Not sorcery, not magic, not divine punishment. The curse is man-made. It is the ability of those in power to construct reality, to shape the memory of the living and the dead alike. Anne's life was ended with a sword, but her story was killed and resurrected with words. Each rumor, each accusation, each official chronicle formed a narrative stronger than any weapon. And that narrative still challenges us to ask how much of what we accept as history is truth and how much is theater written by survivors. Anne Boleyn's final words spoken on the scaffold were carefully chosen. She praised the king, called him gentle and merciful, and committed her soul to God. Many have read those words as submission, but perhaps they were something else. Perhaps they were survival not of her body, but of her dignity. For in that moment she controlled the one thing Henry and Cromwell could not take, how she faced her death. And centuries later, it is her composure that we remember, not their accusations. So what remains when the echoes fade? A queen who should have vanished, who instead became immortal through injustice. A mother whose daughter outshone all her enemies. A woman whose silence and suffering tell us more about power than any victory parade or royal decree. So what remains when the echoes fade? A queen who should have vanished, who instead became immortal through injustice. A mother whose daughter outshone all her enemies. A woman whose silence and suffering tell us more about power than any victory parade or royal decree. If stories like this remind you how fragile truth is and how easily power can twist memory, then stay with us. We have more forgotten chambers to unlock, more voices to recover. Subscribe and step with us into the next shadowed hall of history.